Today's video is actually all about how I took this, and I'm going to talk more about the journey that this plant went through to this giant plant here. This huge plant is a Monstera Adansonii, and I just want to kind of feature this plant and talk more about my journey with it. Since it is the start of a new year, I really wanted to start a new video series on my channel. So this will be the very first one. And I really want to highlight certain plants for each month, and maybe I'll do it twice a month, where I kind of show you the plant and my journey with it and everything that it's been through. Really hope you enjoy this video. I'm going to set my camera up and get in a little bit more of a comfy spot, and we'll talk more about my Monstera Adansonii. This right here is actually cuts from her, I think her first or second chop. I took some cuttings off the pole and just saved them. And just as a memory of where she started, it's crazy to think that this grew into this massive plant right here. It's just unbelievable. This is her latest leaf right here in the middle. It's still very much hardening, but this one here that it put out is massive. It is probably over 17 inches when I last measured it, but look at the leaf size. It's just I can't even get it all in frame. It is crazy. So Monstera Adansonii, this is the exact same plant that I started my pole from. It was just one vine, and at that time I didn't know anything about moss poles, and I came across a video on YouTube, and I think it was by Planterior Decorator, and it was how to make an aesthetically pleasing moss pole. So when I was searching for plant supports or whatever, I came across that video, and then I watched the entire thing a couple of times, and I'm like, that's it, that's perfect, that's exactly what I need and what I want. So I got all the supplies, I ordered everything, and started my very first moss pole, which she is one of my very first poles. It was this in my heartleaf philodendron that I did. After I started it on a pole, this was back in 2021, so it's been quite a while. I didn't know anything about moss poles. I don't really even think many people were posting about moss poles. So I feel like my knowledge base was just very minimal, and I just kind of stuck it on there, not knowing anything about how the plant is supposed to be anchored on and how it's supposed to root into the pole, and I didn't really know much about light or nutrients. So during that time frame of the 7 or 8 months that I knew we were moving, but I didn't want to do too much with my plants, I ended up kind of redoing her on a pole and really took it seriously. And I ended up extending her, and I noticed she had started to increase in leaf size. And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, wow, maybe I can actually do this. Because I just had her at the top of her 3-foot, 2-foot pole, and I just delayed doing anything else with it. And so when I finally was okay, I'm gonna go ahead and extend it. I really wanna grow this plant and see where it can go. That summer, a couple months after moving, my very first video that I filmed with this plant is when I chopped her for the very first time. So once she reached the top of that pole, I knew I needed to chop this plant. And not having chopped a moss pole before, I had no idea what I was doing. But in my head, I remember thinking before chopping her and trying to figure out how I was going to get her off of the plastic and onto wire. And they were starting to really become unstable. I made a moss pole care video way back in the day. It's so old now. And I was having to tie these poles up in my bathroom to the bath towel rail because they kept tipping over. And I'm like, there has to be some better support than this plastic mesh. So I ended up discovering the wire hardware cloth, and I was determined to get these plants transferred onto the wire without having to start over basically. So I kind of took her as my experiment plant since I never chopped one. I did it a little bit differently. So I ended up taking the wire and closing that around the plastic. So the bottom portion of the pole was empty, so I could slide it over the plastic. And the top, I kind of closed it with moss so that the plant could just attach onto the new part and climb up. And so that way the wire being at the very base of the plant would still give it somewhat more support, and it could climb and be a little bit more stable. It did work. I was very surprised that it was standing up, and I was able to somewhat start to transition her onto wire. But Monstera Adansonii, in my experience, has been a finicky plant. I've had her potted into terracotta, into plastic, and if I underwatered her or overwatered her, she would yellow leaves. I just found it very stress sensitive. Even before she was on a pole, when I had her just in a basket, I feel like, okay, this plant is a little bit finicky. So I tried to be as consistent as I could. I was really worried she was going to shock when I chopped her, and she did. I thought I was going to lose the whole plant, and at that point it had been like over a year of growing this plant on a pole, and I was just so like worried I was going to kill the entire plant and then I'd have to start over. I would say probably a good maybe 6, 7 leaves yellowed off, and then she stabilized and it was starting to grow a little bit more. And after that first chop and she started growing more, she actually started growing pretty fast. I was surprised at how well she was climbing. She had climbed to the top of that, I would say by the end of the year, she was pretty much at the top, and I had some pretty big leaves at that point. Like, I was impressed at this plant. I was just shocked that she was growing and I was getting these big leaves. And I had so many other poles that I had started that summer too. And my moss pole area from when I first moved, I had like, I don't know, 7 or 8 poles in this little corner. And then I decided to make this whole wall full of moss poles. And it's crazy to think like this time last year compared to now, it's just crazy to think how far my poles have come. Even from like when I first moved in, it's crazy to look back. I think I chopped her again for the second time in February. It was a little bit cold, but I decided to take this project outside on a somewhat nicer day. And at that point, I got her fully off of the wire. That was my goal, and I was so excited I wanted to get her off of the plastic mesh because her bottom half was still plastic. So I ended up chopping her in half again. I got rid of that plastic base, and so she was fully onto wire. And then I noticed probably towards like the fall, so not that long ago, she was kind of yellowing some bottom leaves. I noticed like she would yellow one and it would drop off, and she would yellow another one, and I felt like she was stressed or something was causing this plant to get unhappy. From what I gathered with her and like caring for her for so long is that she was lacking nutrients, and it was time to do another chop. Because once these plants start growing and attaching, like the root system takes over the entire pole. They have so many roots that wrap around the pole into the moss. The root system itself in the soil like gets so root bound, and then when you go to chop them, you're basically starting over with the root system. So since you're taking that top half and adding it back to the bottom, that node that you have in the soil has to reroot and grow a bunch of new soil roots. You can't just let them grow and grow and grow. They're going to eventually outgrow this pole. So a chop was definitely necessary. I just feel like she was so stressed. She was so tall. I had extended her after I chopped the second time, and she was probably over 6 feet at that point, and she definitely needed another chop. So I chopped her again in the fall, and this is kind of what we have going on with her today. So this is after the third chop. And so since the third chop, I've gotten, I believe, 4 new leaves. And this is the biggest one yet. And actually this one is probably going to be the biggest one since it's brand new. It's just still very much hardening. And I feel like she's only going to get bigger because she is just huge. The root system on this plant is absolutely insane. It's just one vine that I kept. Now I will say she's getting a little top heavy. I need to find like a good ceramic to sit her in because that's super important when these plants get huge because they just get so heavy. The vine gets really thick. You have to water it more often because there's more roots, so they take up water more frequently. Not to mention nutrients. This plant was lacking nutrients because I was using slow release at that time and I was a little inconsistent with it, so that especially is needed when these plants get huge. They need those nutrients to maintain all this big, huge growth. I have noticed a leaf or two on her started to yellow. I would say probably over the course of the last month, and this bottom leaf on her is a bit yellow tinged. So I'm thinking I need to fertilize her more. So I feel like I'm gonna have to give like the max dose for this plant, and I may even have to give a little bit more. I would say this one and my Marble Queen and probably my Splendid are the ones that, and my Cebu Blue are probably the most mature as far as from where they started to their actual size now. And then me not having any like experience beyond this point, I'm not sure what all like these big plants actually need besides like good light and fertilizer. So I'm definitely still trying to figure out like my fertilizer regimen with these big, huge plants to keep them happy and growing well, because yeah, this plant has been climbing since 2021 and years of growth it takes to get here. So I don't want that to all go to waste if this plant isn't getting what it needs and it ends up not making it. You know, I don't even want to think about that. So yeah, I do have some challenges ahead of me with these big poles, and eventually I'm going to have to get to a stopping point. So it's a lot to think about. She's gonna be huge though, because she has a good, I would say 3 feet to climb on this current pole that she's on, and I'll probably extend it another foot or two before I chop this one again. So I'm very curious to see if she's gonna size up any more than what she already has. But Monstera Adansonii, I mean, it loves to climb obviously, and they look so beautiful trailing too. So if you do have it climb, I would say just be consistent with your watering and make sure it's getting nutrients and that you're giving it a good amount of light, and hopefully it'll do well. If you are having a hard time with this plant, I've been there, trust me, but don't give up if you really want to grow it to maturity. Just kind of figure out your routine with it. And I have mine in my chunky moss pole mix, and like I said, I'm trying to give it everything it needs. I'm still trying to figure out the nutrient part with these big poles. But yeah, don't give up, and they're worth it, even though they are a lot of work. If you really enjoy looking at these big, huge leaves, then it's definitely worth it. So yeah, I hope you really enjoyed my like Monstera Adansonii flashback. I don't know what to call this series, this title. You'll have to let me know of a good title. I'm thinking of like, I don't know, a plant highlight. I don't know what to call it. But if you have any questions regarding like Monstera or Monstera Adansonii or moss poles, I'll make sure to link all of my moss pole like previous chops on her down below, as well as all of my other videos on moss poles and like all my supplies. But definitely leave a comment if you have any questions, or just leave a comment, you know. I do love reading through my comments. So, but yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you guys again here very soon.